Good afternoon, Madam Chair. If I could indulge the committee, Representative Morris and I would like to speak together.
Terrific. You have your 3 minutes.
Thank you. Fair enough.
We'll see how good that goes.
Chairs Schlossberg, Fleischman, Boucher, Ranking Member LaValle, thank you so much. We're here to testify on behalf of Senate Bill number 2. We understand that that represents potentially a new way of looking at ECS, especially in light of the CJEF lawsuit. As your committee is pondering what to put onto SB2, we're hopeful that you might consider the contents of our bill 6793, which Representative Morris and I introduced together, which is to move towards a DRG ranking system for ECS allocation. As we're all aware, the Department of Education ranks all the towns and cities based on DRG rankings, which capture 7 socioeconomic factors, some of which have been brought up by this committee this morning or today. Our proposal is real simple. For those who are the most stressed, DRG Is would get the most per pupil funding. Those who are least stressed, As, would get the least funding. In exchange for the A's getting the least funding and the B's and so on, they would get as compensation mandate relief. So our view is that everyone should feel like they come away with something in this process. I'll turn over now to Representative Morris.
Great. Thank you, and good afternoon. So you got the basic summary of it. I think the challenge for the longest time for the legislature has been how do you have large towns, small towns come together with a compromise that we can all agree upon. Therefore, we think the best thing is taking a look at the DR, because the DRG, I mean, you have the ability to change it or fluctuate it. But if we do that, prorating that, the reality is most of our poorer districts would then get the larger funding. And as you go down the ranking, you become smaller or less, more economically able. You get less. But many of the meetings we've already had with a lot of the superintendents, primarily in Fairfield County, said that listen, getting mandated relief would make a big difference. So at the end of the day, you have to have a reform that has something in it for everyone. So we think that would work. Now, there's been a question in terms of the Horton versus Meskel decision in Grand List. It's interesting that you have a Republican and a Democrat here. I represent the poorest part of Norwalk. All right, we have come from a town similar to Stanford that has a large Grand List. It's interesting. Representative Williams here represents a part of Norwalk, more affluent part, but actually New Canaan. So you have a Democrat and a Republican who actually are coming here to say that, listen, we probably have the greatest diversity if you want to take a look at, and probably even what would be differences and what would make sense. And for towns like Norwalk and Stanford, we would actually say that the Horton versus Meskel, right now we're doing 90% Grand List and 10% of median income. The last time we looked at this, many of us would argue that a town's wealth should be more so based upon your median income. Because in my town, I have people that have had their homes, whatever, they're house rich, they are cash poor. There's no way that they're going to add more money to our budget. So I've got kids who look just like those in New Haven, Hartford, or the poorer parts of the state who now are not getting properly educated or are given the same kind of resources. So this would make a bigger difference for us, even if you could take that 90-10 and make it a 60-40, or even if, because the committee has the ability to do it, to say that, listen, we have a few towns, and by the way, if you were to just to take a look at the top 25%, the top 25% towns are on the Grand List, and those are the bottom 50% in median income, it will come to about 12 towns. We've done carve-outs in other ways, but if we really fully understand it, at the end of the day, we want to educate all kids in the state of Connecticut, and we recognize that poverty is a major indicator that a kid is likely to fail. So we want to take on our responsibility and fulfill the CJEF mandate. It is better that we actually take a look at leveling the playing field in that way. And those are the 12 towns. And for everybody else, since we're not spending more money, because I'm not asking for more money, we've actually come up with, that's how you'll do the distribution. And we think that'll be a fair way. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Fleischman.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your advocacy and your passion. I'm a little confused as to sort of some of the sources for your positions. You talked about the CJEF mandate. So there's a court case that was taken up by the Supreme Court. It's under appeal. So there is no mandate from the CJEF lawsuit.
Yeah, decision, not mandate.
The mandates that we face come from Horton v. Meskel. There was a Horton v. Meskel 2 that upheld a state formula that was basically premised on adjusted net equalized grand list, and then Sheff versus O'Neill, which addressed some of the inequities in the Hartford region. Those are the settled laws that we have to uphold. So what Horton v. Meskel focused on was equalized net grand list because that represents a community's ability to raise funds for its schools, right? Property taxes are the means that we give to municipalities for raising funds. Income taxes go to the state of Connecticut. So if you start talking about the level of income wealth, that tells you how much your residents may be paying to the state. It tells you how many people are in poverty and may have children with extra needs in education, which I grant you I think is a very fair point. But it's just inarguable that Greenwich, Stamford, and Norwalk, with a small change in their mill rate, can raise a lot more funds than those communities that are farther down on the list. So I guess I'm looking for your help in understanding how, as we revisit the formula, we could go ahead and do something that steps so far away from weighting the grand list, which Horton v. Meskel said had to be the central determinative factor besides the number of kids you're educating and the student census, basically.
Thank you, Chairman Fleischman, for that comment. Our view is this. Obviously, we have to respect the Supreme Court decision, and we need to follow those guidelines. Personally, I think it was unfortunate the Supreme Court not only mandated the legislature take action, but actually suggested a way to do it. But it is what it is. Respectfully, I don't agree with the statement that property values determine a town's ability to pay taxes. I chaired the Board of Estimate and Taxation for the City of Norwalk for 8 years, and so respectfully, to the best of my knowledge, no one ever went into Norwalk City Hall to the tax collector's office and paid their property taxes with a plunk of land, you know, that they own. It has to come from cash flow, and cash flow is separate from the inherent value of the property in the town. Secondly, in terms of where we have to work now within the parameters of the current Supreme Court decision, we certainly respect that. I know there's been some discussion. Right now the formula is 90-10. It appears that the formula could be revised down to 60-40, 51-49, and one possibility would be to make that income component maybe based on the DRG system. So our proposal would work within the current framework. Secondly, just for full disclosure, Norwalk has been an active member of the CJEF lawsuit. We funded it. Former Mayor Alex Knopp is a lead attorney, and our Mayor Rilling, who's here, is on the board. We certainly hope that going forward, the Supreme Court will make a new decision, which could then, move us in a different direction.
And to add to that, again, with not a mandate, but the decision that the Supreme Court made, just the fact that we're doing the 90-10 made it clear it wasn't like the court was saying that grand list had to be 100% of the determinant factor, and that's why, as you heard me earlier, I said, listen, we can do a 60-40 or something like that, because when you begin to take a look at property, even up all along the shoreline, you got many properties, even outside of Norwalk, where you have people that are owning that property third generation, senior citizens on fixed incomes. All right, their mortgages are paid. That's one reason why they're able to stay there, but they're paying taxes. These are people who, it's whatever their income is, that's their real ability to pay. And that's why we've always argued that median income ought to be within the formula weighted more so than what we currently do, because it is more, that is a more realistic ability of, I have people in Bridgeport, for instance, who has the highest, one of the highest mill rates going. If I said, oh, listen, because of your commercial properties, we can add another 1 or 2%. The reason we don't do that is because we know the people there, their median income is so low, they don't have the ability to pay if you add another mill rate. So it's the same thing in a Stamford, a Norwalk, and some of the other coastline areas. Again, if you would come to my, if anyone were to come to my part of South Norwalk, it is as poor, if not poorer, than some of the other urban, larger urban cities in this state. Our school system right now, I believe our minority percentage is over 62%. Our free and reduced lunch,
50%.
is it 50%? Because when you're in a community like that, those who may live in the more affluent areas, they can go and put their kids in private school. But that still doesn't help in the fact that if you have the larger central core of my city, is median income, they're blue-collar workers, or they're people that are service workers with working 2 and 3 jobs, minimum wage jobs, I would add, at a rental, I mean, how many of us could afford to be in a rental for a 1-bedroom apartment at like $1,500? Can't afford to do it, but that's what happens in the community in which I live.
Thank you.
And by the way, and those are the kids who we as a state have responsibility to educate. And we've been beyond the point, I know, in Norwalk, where our community has the capacity to do so. So I'll just end on this one last thing to give you an example. Danbury, fantastic town, is very much like the city of Norwalk. And the dollars they get, I believe that they're due, they should have those dollars. All right? The only difference between the city of Danbury and Norwalk, their median income is about $10,000 less than ours. Their grand list is significantly lower. They get twice the amount of money we get in ECS for similar populations. There's no rhyme or reason to that. So the recommendation we give would work well for us, and not just us. I think it actually solves the problem that we have for the entire state, because for most of the legislators I've talked to from smaller cities, Madam and Mr. Chair, they said, listen, give me mandate relief, and I'm a happy person because I'm not getting that much in ECS anyway. The mandate relief makes it. And for those with the larger towns, they said, listen, this makes sense. It's more fairer. By your DIRG, you've already determined that we have the greatest need.
Thank you. Well, you'll be happy to know that mandate relief is something that we're working on in a bipartisan manner in this committee, and that, knock on wood, I think will move forward. You're a strong and effective voice for the positions you hold. I agree with much of what you said. There are people in my town and every town who have difficulty paying their property taxes. Nonetheless, the equalized net grand list is still was the focus of the Horton v. Meskill decision. We'll continue the dialogue. I'm sure you'll be talking with friends from Danbury who will point out to you that, in fact, that they have a much lower grand list is a major factor for them. But it's really valuable that you've done such a clear job in explaining your position. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative McCarthy-Vehy. Oh, no, don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. I was kidding when I said 3 minutes. You knew that. Representative McCarthy-Vehy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both of you, Representative Wilms and Representative Morris, for being here. And this is a really interesting conversation for me, and I just wanted to follow up in terms of the comments, or one of the comments or questions from Chairman Fleischman with respect to the mill rate and property taxes. And one of the things that strikes me is that in your community, when you talk about folks being able to pay their tax bill and walking into City Hall or Town Hall and cash flow, is the difficulty of the loan market. And for example, in the past number of years, there were a lot of folks who used lines of credit, home equity loans, to help to pay their bills. And as we've seen kind of the market change in terms of people's ability to do so, because that's, I mean, I think it's a fair discussion that we're having, and I think it's an important one, because certainly communities like ours along the coast, we do have advantages in terms of our property values. But I wondered if you're seeing that in your community, folks who may have been able to take advantage of some of those benefits having a property of value, and how that's changed.
Well, thank you, Representative, for that question. I guess I could put on my other hat. I am a banker when I'm not here, and certainly when someone applies for a home equity loan or a mortgage, and they need the proceeds maybe to live day to day or handle their expenses, certainly banks look at a number of criteria. One, of course, is the appraised value of the house, of the property. But secondly, they look at cash flow. They want your personal income tax statements. They want to see your pay stubs. And if you're house rich but income poor, you ain't getting the loan. I mean, and that's just kind of the way it works. And you know, I think it's important to understand that, and I think Representative Morris was just spot on, is that a lot of people are struggling there. There's people who, you know, maybe they grew up in their parents' house. They couldn't afford to buy their own parents' house based on the income that they're making, and they're still there because maybe their parents helped them out and let them live there. So they're living in this great house that they grew up in, that their parents helped them out with. But would they be able to get a mortgage on that exact house with their current income? Well, the answer is no. Or what if you do as someone who lives in, let's say, Rowayton, which I think we would all agree is a beautiful, very affluent, you know, beach community section of Norwalk, mega homes. But if you're retired and you're on a fixed income, and then you have to be, you know, and then you're told you got to pay $40,000 in property taxes, that's unsustainable. And so, you know, there are these realities where there's these wide divergences from equating the value of the grand list of a town with the ability of its citizenry to pay taxes.
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate both aspects of this conversation, because I think that there are arguments you made that there are folks who have different choices in different communities, but the common thread here that I hear, whether we're talking about grand list or about income, is that we focus and make sure that we prioritize the needs of our poorest and most in need students. And so I appreciate that part of the conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Lavielle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, both of you, representatives, and
Good afternoon.
it's very. I'm very pleased to see two colleagues from the Norwalk delegation here. Thank you for coming and for your clear testimony. I think you've made your arguments very clear. You know, I share them, so we don't need to go through that. But I do want to ask you a couple of other questions in the spirit of helping us as we think on the Education Committee about where to go to end up with a formula that indeed offers every student in this state, no matter where they live, a quality education. That's all of our goal. So one question for you. As we talk about ECS, we know that there are some other types of funding, Alliance District funding, whatever. Norwalk gets some of that every year, or has for the past few years. What is your feeling in terms of the importance of funding coming in particular through the ECS stream, as opposed to another one of the line items or funding streams?
I need to make sure I understand the question. Are you saying rather than it coming in as an Alliance District grant, it just be a part of the ECS grant?
Well, let me phrase that in an easier, less convoluted. Sorry about that. Would you like to have more of your funding come through ECS than by any other means? And if so, why? And do you think that makes a difference?
I think the reason we ended up having to do the Alliance grants was because the fact that the existing ECS grant itself had become so convoluted that it wasn't meeting the goals that we had. So if we take the criteria for an Alliance grant, all right, which again heavily weights poverty, and there's certain indicators, and those are the same indicators that we're using within an ECS grant in terms of how we're weighting formula, I have no problem with that happening. Because in fact, given the example that we gave, you've used DERGs as the as your major criteria. I think all of your DERGs would help end up getting the Alliance grant money anyway. Those the H and I DERGs, that money is going there. So me personally, I wouldn't have a problem with that as long as it's just like whatever you want to wait for special ed, there's a specific need that is there, fine. You know, you're doing something specific. I wouldn't have a problem. At the end of the day, it's are we directing the dollars to where the greatest need is? Now, I'm certain my superintendent, if he was sitting here today, barring if we didn't fix this anytime soon, and I'm pretty sure every alliance district that is here would say, if we're not going to fix this, the only way that we are going to improve education in the state of Connecticut is by being that very deliberate, by continuing to do the alliance grant funding. Because at the end of the day, when you take a look at where the state of Connecticut ranks among every other state, the only thing that's pulling us down in terms of numbers are those districts where we have unmet needs, which are primarily those H&I DIRGs.
And just to expand on Representative Morris's response, one of the advantages that we think of the DRG system that we'd like to commend for your consideration is that it encompasses, well, first of all, it's determined by an independent agency. It's not determined by the legislature. And I think having a third party brings objectivity to the process and might reduce some of the irrationality and unfairness around it. But there are 7 criteria that the Department of Education uses to determine a DRG ranking, and they are median family income, which already exists here, parent education levels, parent occupations, family structure, the percentage of students eligible for free reduced school meals, home language, which was a question that come up earlier, and district enrollment. And so, you know, these 7 measures of socioeconomic condition, we think certainly would more accurately portray what's actually going on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, actually, the more that he's given that answer, I think that really does give you the answer of a way for us to no longer have to have all these other different subsets of grants. Because we did talk about earlier, you have criteria right now within your DIRGs. If you have that independent agencies taking a look to say, listen, within DIRG I have a large portion of some other major indicator, all right? At any point in time, you're able to move, I would believe, districts from one DIRG to another if their criteria now met something else in another DIRG. And you wouldn't have to change the formula. No need for ever changing the formula in the future.
Just one final question, specifically, as you look at the formula as it stands now, and I understand what framework you're suggesting, but as you look at the formula as it stands now, or any suggestions that have been made in the recent budget proposal, are there any other factors, like, you know, poverty, how ELL, and so on and so forth, any that you'd like to comment on or think are relevant for us to consider, or would that all be taken into account with the DIRG system?
Yeah, actually, I thought that had already been implied in what I had shared. Whenever I talk about the major indicators, because those standard indicators are there. Surely we know if you've got a large ELL population, there's an additional cost. There's an additional cost to make certain that happens. So yeah, I thought that was already implied, and that needs to be the additional consideration. Free and reduced lunch. I've always been an advocate of, when you start talking about money follows the child or whatever, that, you know, we need to take a look at Title I funding, the number of kids who are considered as part of your Title I funding, because that helps you to understand poverty, and that's a standard across the board for regardless of which district that we're in.
I guess also, just to elaborate, it would seem to me that since we do need to respect the current Supreme Court decision, that we could potentially, I guess, keep the grand list value, you know, at, let's say, 51% of the formula, and we could make 49%, instead of it being just family median income, it could be the DRG rankings. So it seems to me that would be, I'd like to commend that as something for you to, you know, take a look at, and I think it might be consistent with current law.
And you know what? It goes back to your grants. If you actually take a look at a lot of the grants that we do around the state from CSDE, one of the criteria in them is typically, it goes back to those earlier court decisions, is how are you reducing racial and economic isolation? All right, and so that automatically lets, especially the economic isolation piece of it, it automatically tells us that we're giving money because we recognize that poverty, economic isolation, is a major factor in whether kids are receiving a proper education or whether the proper resources are there. All right? So, again, the grand list, I can't spend money on that. We've given you that argument. Hopefully everybody's hearing the larger piece, because we've been funding all these different separate streams, extra money, different ways, whether it's accountable for or not. This now gives us a higher level of accountability that I think we talk about results-based accountability. Well, guess what? If we're using this one kind of, these certain common catch baskets for how we're determining how we're funding, and based on those specific needs, I think we have a better ability to measure the effectiveness as well for those populations in those communities.
Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Belcito.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a very short thing. I just met with a person called Katie Roy. I don't know if you know her.
Yes.
She is excellent. I would recommend that you contact her. I have her address and everything else if you want that. I think she could be very, very helpful in this area that you're working on.
Representative Belcito, thank you very much for those comments. I fully agree with you as the past president in the last session of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus with your Senate chair. We did a public informational session. It's worthwhile for legislators to go back and take a look at, because Katie Roy was there and she provided excellent testimony, because with her Policy Institute, they're able to provide different iterations based on the different criteria that we're talking about what that would look like, you know? Just like the criteria that we've just given here today, that if we were to actually take all of our different towns and say, this is what goes in this DIRG and this DIRG, and they could play with the numbers very easily, rather than us jumping all over the place. I would highly even strongly recommend that maybe this committee may want to do a forum with her doing that at some point with all the different iterations that we're all taking a look at, because then people could find out at the end of the day, where do you stand? The premise that Representative Wilms and I came together on is that at the end of the day, it doesn't need to be a Republican or a Democratic solution. It doesn't need to be a rich town or a poor town solution. It needs to be a solution that benefits everyone in the state of Connecticut. And for that to happen, we've already had a system where those that are wealthy understand that, you know what, yeah, you've got to carry the burden for those that don't have. But yet, there's some accountability that they want. And for those that don't have, all right, they're saying, listen, we need to make certain that that uniformly happens throughout the state. So, Katie Roy, I would certainly encourage this committee to utilize her services.
Yeah. Thank you, and she will be appearing later today.
Thank you. With
But
that
I
public
thought I'd
service
give you that
announcement for,
information. Thank you.
for
I'm not promoting her, but she really is a very intelligent person.
I think she's going to be very happy to hear your ringing endorsements.
Yeah,
Thank
if I
you.
can, Madam Chairman, it was interesting. When you really think about it, a lot of the concept that we talked about the earlier bill, ours didn't get here, but we don't care. Name on a bill, it's what gets done. A lot of what we put together in the testimony that you heard today has been a result of that hearing. That really, it talked about mandated relief, and everyone universally was saying, yeah, that's how we get there. So that's the no-brainer part, all right? And again, so what is that part of that formula? I think I appreciate the questions from Representative Lavielle, because whereas we did it all by a DIRG, but you got down into the weeds of what Katie Roy could help us to do, because even within some of our DIRGs, there may be some indicators that may be slightly different, that she could actually walk us through a process and help us to get through it, and we can make a really sound decision at the end of the day.
Thank you very much for your testimony, gentlemen.